Well, hello everyone. Peace, salam, and shalom, and welcome back to our weekly spiritual explorations on spiritual alphabet. Our letter for the day is U for Unity, and we will be discussing it with Dan Reimer, one of our dear friends, colleague in several initiatives that we have worked together. But before that, please remember to mute your mics. All these videos are available on our Interfaith Center's YouTube channel. And if you miss a session, you're always welcome to go back and listen to the program on one of the videos. So before we go to Dan, a little bit about unity. So we're talking about unity, which refers to living in harmony with other people, building communities together, working for a common cause, knowing that when one person gains, all of us gain. And when one person falls, everybody falls. So it's more than just a passing acquaintance with our neighbors or a temporary agreement among the parties. It's not a spiritual feeling, rather, it's a feeling of harmony which runs much, much deeper and lasts longer and broadens our spiritual life. So, for those of us who do interfaith work like me, unity is a very important topic for us because we are engaged with friends and co-workers who are so very different from us. And every day we live through those differences. So for me personally, unity has never meant conformity. Unity does not mean being same. In fact, unity means embracing people who are very different from you, but embracing them with all your heart and all your soul, with all those differences, and living with those differences. Because I personally believe that all these divinely guided paths lead to the one same summit, and to have lived one religion fully is like we have lived all of them. So it's a very important topic for me, and we have a very special friend who's leading us on this topic, Dan Reimer. Dan is a public health official, retired as a public health official, but I have known Dan for several years as one of the leaders in our Baha'i community. And I really got to know Dan deeply is back in 2016 when we invited him to join our Interfaith Friendship Camp. And Interfaith Friendship Camp is is a summer camp for elementary school children who come together for 1 week to learn about each other's faith and to build relationships. And Dan designed a curriculum for Baha'i Faith, and Dan led the teachings for Baha'i Faith. And he was an immediate heartthrob in the camp. Everybody called him Grandpa Dan, and everybody loved him. And it was a beautiful example of being in unity with somebody who's so different from you. So I have had the privilege of knowing and learning from him since then. So, with that said, I want to invite both of my colleagues, Dr. J. McDaniels, who is our co facilitator, and Dan Reimer, who is the teacher of the day, to this conversation and to lead on.
I'll start, but then I'll turn it over to you very quickly, Dan. But I want you to know the question that I bring to your presentation. And I'll put it in musical terms. So I play the guitar. And so there's my guitar. And I'm going to play a C chord. And then I'm going to play a C chord that has a little off, unresolved sound. And so there's the major C and what's called the C7th. In the C7th, when you hear it, you think, oh, it needs to be resolved. It needs to go to a major chord. But in my life, there's never been a perfect resolution of tensions. Oh, there have been moments, but it doesn't take much for a new tension to emerge of some kind. So it's a real question. Does the harmony we seek for ourselves, for others, is it a harmony that in which all tensions are resolved? Or is it a harmony that can embrace tensions and live with them even as unresolved? And I don't ask this question theoretically. I ask it in terms of family life, relationship with colleagues and friends, relationship in church. And I know that in my church, people can hold this high ideal of a harmony in which there's no more tensions. But I kind of wonder if that's not missing the point. If there's a harmony, a unity that can be felt and known amid the tensions, not with them resolved. And I also think about the oneness of God. I know that Baha'is and Jews and Muslims and even Christians talk about the oneness of God. Is it a oneness in which all tensions are resolved? Or is it a oneness that embraces tensions too? So those are really the questions that I struggle with and like to think about. So thank you for being with us. And I'm not asking you to resolve all these questions for me today, but I wanted to lift them up as worthy of our consideration as we hear about unity. And with that, Dan, thanks. Please proceed. Unmute.
Thank you, Jay, for that challenging introduction, and Sophia for your kind remarks. I really feel honored that the two of you accepted my offer to do this, because I'm not a member of the clergy. I'm not an author. I'm not an academician. I guess if there's a category for me, it would be practitioner, because I've tried to put into practice what I believe about unity. And I want to get to your questions, Jay, toward the end, because I think some of the things I have to share may illuminate them from the outset. And if I don't, please come back to me, because I have some thoughts about that I like. So let me just share some about my journey before I get into the really subject of unity. My journey to discover the many aspects of unity really began with my father, who was studying to be a minister in the Church of Christ in seminary in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Maybe it was St. Paul, when he learned about the Baha'i Faith and actually began to investigate it in order to prove that the revealer of these writings was actually the Antichrist. So he read the writings, he looked at the so-called prophecies. He even went from the Greenacre Baha'i School in Maine, where he was investigating, down to the Harvard Divinity School to look up old translations of the Bible in Greek and Aramaic, because he really wanted to look at the words. And the more he investigated, he actually became a believer in that summer. So later he met and married my mom in Green Bay, Wisconsin. And when I was 2 years old, he moved the family back to Elliott, Maine, so that he could become the manager of this institute, which he did for many years. This institute draws a wide diversity of people, and our house at the head of the road leading down the hill became like a hospitality point where people would stop in and say hello on their way down. And so we had all kinds of people coming through our living room, sitting at our dining table, black, white, red, university presidents and disabled poor people. I mean, it was just the personification of diversity. And in fact, I like to say that my parents not just taught me the principle that there's only one race, the human race, they lived it. So this became normal for me. And when I became a school age and I got to experience young people my age who treated their fellow classmates who were from families of color with the prejudice they must have been taught by their parents, it was painful for me to see people who were like my friends treated that way. I became curious why that was the case. And I actually developed a compassion that motivated me to a lifelong commitment to promote unity, beginning from that early experience from my parents. So first a social worker and then a public health official, I sought means to advance social justice and equity at the level of the individual, the community, and the institution, because all three in my learning need to be engaged for us to have really the kind of social change that we need in order to be unified. On the individual level, I embrace the teaching of the Baha'i Faith that we all have to search deep in our hearts to root out prejudice that either we've been taught or we have unconsciously absorbed by being a part of this broader culture. We believe that this rooting out process is a part of the process of spiritual transformation that our souls must undertake in order to purify and prepare ourselves to return to our Lord. So I've tried to find practical approaches to transform communities by facilitating a 10-week course from the Institute for the Healing of Racism that was developed by the eminent author and journalist Nathaniel Rutstein, adopted by many municipalities, particularly for their police forces. I also developed a course when I was the director of public health in Fort Worth on cultural competency, because so many of us in human services were white, and the people we served were Native American, African American, Asian American, many immigrants, as a matter of fact. And the ability to interact with one another where we all feel comfortable, to me, was essential. I first started in our department, and word of mouth got out, and pretty soon other departments were requesting it. And finally, the mayor decided this should be something citywide. This describes a bit of my journey of how I've tried to get here. Let me tell you how I have experienced unity in three ways: unity of mankind, unity of all religions, and unity with God. So first of all, unity of all mankind. I saw with my own eyes the rainbow of humanity in the opening session of the World Congress of Baha'is in New York City in 1992. Over 28,000 participants from all over the world attended, from more than 900 countries, islands, and dependencies. The opening ceremony was very dramatic because from two V-shaped aisles, a procession of people from all of these countries, nations, ethnicities walked as the name of their tribe group was being read. And it took 15 minutes for that procession to unfold. And there was the rainbow because you saw every color, shape, and size imaginable. I also experienced a few summers ago in the friendship camp that Sophia was talking about. She actually stole some of my thunder because I was the oldest teacher there among this wonderful group of Jewish, Christian, Muslim, and Baha'i teachers who'd each developed parallel curriculums around the theme of superheroes that really engaged the imagination of the children. And we talked about the foundational hero being the manifestation of God, a historical hero, someone like Paul or one of the imams, and a modern hero, someone who exemplified the teachings. And each of the children got to hear about all of these faiths. It was a wonderful experience. I found the children to be attentive, curious, engaged, and developing new insights about the subject of unity. So as the oldest, as Sophia mentioned, I took a marker and printed Grandpa above my name, Dan Reimer, and encouraged the kids to think of me that way. And I think it did create a special bond. And that feeling was confirmed a few months later when I was out shopping for groceries, and from 3 aisles away, I heard this young voice calling, "Hi, Grandpa Dan." And this little black child ran up, gave me a big hug. This last example spans the concept of unity of mankind and the unity of religions, but let me take this last step a little further. I've experienced the unity of religions through scriptures of various faiths. I actually went to Frederick and Mary Van Bersat's website and found the same paragraph that Sophia read at the beginning of this introduction. And I'd like to share my screen with you to look at some of these teachings about unity from various faiths. This was already read, but it goes on to say, let me focus on it, a spiritual practice of hospitality helps us to learn to respect differences and celebrate diversity in creation. Unity is about confirming commonalities. This can be as simple as acknowledging how you are like another person, and it can lead to actions demonstrating your solidarity with others. Without unity, there is little hope for compassion, justice, or peace. So here's a Hindu teaching I found. A fundamental Hindu principle is one of unity of all created things. Behind diversity, there is unity. Behind individual souls, there is the self with a capital S, one with the divine. By its very nature, Hinduism is not a religion of a chosen people or an appointed community. It rejects the approach which divides humanity into believers and non-believers, kafirs and heathens. It regards such divisions as spiritually untenable. It expresses man's seeking for truth. Therefore, it belongs to all. And from the Buddhist teachings, he who experiences the unity of life sees his own self in all beings, and all beings in his own self, and looks on everything with an impartial eye. From Judaism, love thy friend as thyself. Behold how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. From Christian teachings, I in them and you in me, so that they may be brought into complete unity. And over all these virtues, put on love, which binds them together, all together in perfect unity. To bring unity to all things in heaven and on earth under Christ. And from Islam, from the last sermon of the Holy Prophet, all mankind is from Adam and Eve. An Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor a non-Arab has any superiority over an Arab. Also, a white has no superiority over black, nor does a black have any superiority over a white, except by piety and good action. And here's a paragraph from the Baha'i teachings. The fundamental principle enunciated by Baha'u'llah, the followers of his faith firmly believe, is that religious truth is not absolute, but relative. That divine revelation is a continuous and progressive process. that all the great religions of the world are divine in origin, that their basic principles are in complete harmony, that their aims and purposes are one and the same, that their teachings are but facets of one truth, that their functions are complementary, that they differ only in the non-essential aspects of their doctrines, and that their missions represent successive stages in the spiritual evolution of human society. I'm going to show you a chart that tries to depict this. The notion is progressive revelation, that God has revealed himself over time through these various dispensations, each of which has a building block. Now, you can't read all of this, obviously, but from the symbols at the bottom of the chart, you can get the idea. And Jay, I think this goes back to your thoughts about the oneness of God, because our belief is that all these religions came from the same source. How could there be more than one creator of the world? Now, each of these faiths may refer to that divine source by a different name, and they may have come at a different time, but it's the same source. And my father used to say, Danny, he called me Danny, think of these manifestations like the sun. We saw the sun today, we called it Wednesday. We'll see the sun tomorrow. It'll be a new day, we'll give it a new name. We'll call it Thursday, but it's the same sun. And so this is the foundation of our belief about the oneness of God and the unity of all religions. So let me shift now. I've talked about the unity of mankind and the unity of religions. Let me share with you some of how I've thought and experienced unity with God. Like all the Abrahamic faiths, Baha'i teaches that man has been created in the image and likeness of God. The soul of man emanates from God, has been endowed with the capacity to reflect his qualities and attributes. But one of our purposes in life is to develop these virtues or soul traits, as we're calling them, and return to him in the next world. So that's what I believe. How have I experienced that? Well, lately, my wife Jennifer and I have been studying a course called The Divine Art of Meditation by the author of a book in the same name. And she's teaching us about the relationship between prayer and meditation. One way of looking at it is that prayer is speaking to God, whether it's to praise him, to beg for his forgiveness, to ask for his assistance. That's speaking to God, and meditation then becomes listening to God, waiting for the inspiration, the intimation, the imagination to spark in response to our opening a channel of communication with our Lord. Something that's been helpful in this process is viewing this website that Farnaz has created called semper-temple.org that that provides quotations from a variety of faiths on the concept of meditation and the practices they describe and some related subjects. She also introduced us to a little book called Practice the Presence of God by Brother Lawrence, a 15th century monk who wrote about the daily practices he developed to feel in the presence of God at any time during the day. And I could wax eloquent about how these practices, these disciplines we're learning, enable us to shut out the world and focus on nearness to God. Finally, I want to share with you a deeply personal experience of how I felt the presence of God in one of the darkest moments of my life in Africa, where I lived from 1981 to 87. And I'll close my sharing now so I can see with you. So just as there's no clergy in the Baha'i Faith, there's also no missionaries, but it's still considered a meritorious thing to do, to leave your homeland and go be of service and unity with people in another part of the world. So my first wife and I went to South Africa when our boys were 7 and 13. And I went there as a consultant to the Ministry of Health and Social Welfare. And a little black republic called Bophuthatswana. We were maybe a member of the 2% minority of white people living in that country at the time. And it was very challenging, leaving our family and support systems behind, being on our own, trying to adjust to a new culture, being of service. And we had the embarrassing experience of our marriage falling apart. Embarrassing because we were there to serve and we were not setting a good example, and it was profoundly painful. We tried everything, therapy, separating, moving together. We were not able to resolve that tension, Jay. And ultimately, I reached the decision that I needed to return to the States and start over. So as I was making that plan, I was looking at the contract I had that paid for my way to come there and help us set up expenses, promised to pay my way back. And I read that if I left before the end of the contract, I would not be paid for my way to go there. The expenses they incurred to bring me there would be taken out of my last paycheck, and I would not be allowed to take my pension earned out of the country. And those circumstances, plus the fact that never before had I left a job without having a job in front of me, and I was flying blind coming back to the States. I developed a lot of anxiety about that, even to the state of being panicky, and I wasn't sleeping. I just happened to be reading a little book called Divine Therapy, which is a collection of Baha'i writings on a variety of subjects, and I was on the chapter, Trust in God. I get emotional just thinking about it. So I opened this chapter and I read passage after passage. Place your affairs in the hands of God if you want to find peace and contentment. Place your affairs in the hands of God if you want to find true happiness. And the reason I get so emotional about this is I realized then that I had never done that. I've been raised to believe, to pray, but I'd also been raised to be resourceful, be a problem solver. And I felt God guided me by enabling me to solve whatever came across my path, but I couldn't solve that. So I prayed and I said, Baha'u'llah, I'm in your hands. And that night I slept like a baby. I got up the next morning, I met with my minister of health and explained to him my plans, expressed my concerns about the contract. He said, oh no, you're in your second contract of 3 years. You've completed all the requirements. None of those provisions will affect you. I really felt he had me right there. And you know, even though it took 6 months to find the job of health director for Orange County in North Carolina, I never felt worried. I felt that he was moving the pieces around the chessboard till they'd be just in the right place. So, pardon my emotion, but that's my experience of being in unity with God. So let me come back to your questions about tension, Jay. I love this question because it brings up the topic of conflict. And one of the verses in the Baha'i Faith is, it is through the clash of differing opinions that the spark of truth is lit. And so we believe conflict is a natural, normal, even helpful aspect of life that we should embrace. Another principle that relates to this question is one of the independent search after truth, which says everyone is responsible for finding truth and no one can decide for another what that truth is. This is why Baha'i parents cannot even commit their children to the Baha'i faith. Each of us has to decide for ourselves when we reach the age of 15, which is considered the beginning of maturity, if this is a path we want to continue to follow. And so we do not think every conflict has to be resolved. That in fact, we revere and respect one another's right to hold a different belief, and we don't have to be the same. we can have lots of diversity and still be unified. So if I don't know if that gets to the point you're seeking, but that's what thought came to my mind, and I'll stop there and open up for others' experiences around unity.
Dan, I think you answered my question just fine. So that when you prayed in that way and you slept like a baby that night, to my mind, you are resting in something very deep that holds everything, including the tensions. So I just want to say thank you. So, and you give me new eyes for unity. It's such an often used word, sometimes overused. And sometimes people hear in unity sameness. That's not what you're saying. Sometimes people hear in unity something static. That's not what you're saying. So you give me new eyes for unity too. Thank you. Let's open it up and see if others would like to share or say anything. Dan has presented us with this theme and shared his own life as he approaches it. How about unity for you? Where does that fit into your life? And how does that fit into your life? I think Dan and I and everybody, Sophia, we would love to hear.
Dan, I have one question. And could you talk more about the unity of the community? Somehow I understand the unity of God and the possibilities there, the unity of humans one to another. But right now it seems like we're just struggling so much with this idea of a unity of community. And I just would appreciate more.
That's a wonderful concern. I share it, but I also see building blocks. I'm exploring avenues to depolarize America in an organization I've come across called Braver Angels, that is trying to bring red people and blue people and independents together to work at dialoguing with mutual respect without trying to convince one another, and much less avoid condemning one another, which seems to be the current predominant sentiment now. And I think there's possibilities there. They've developed an excellent curriculum. They separate blues and reds initially, and they have a conversation, and then they come together. I haven't experienced it yet because it's new in my exploration. I'm also exploring an organization called Coming to the Table, which brings Black and white folks together to have conversations about the plight of people of color in our nation. It actually requires a 2-hour seminar from the University of Minnesota's Center for Awareness of Trauma and Resilience. And I took the 2-hour course, and it really is helpful in understanding the plight of people of color in this country and the trauma they have experienced through prejudice, discrimination, unequal opportunity, etc. And what measures have to be taken in order to resolve the trauma that is not unlike the post-traumatic stress disorder experienced by people who've been in war. So I think these are possible avenues, but what it requires is individuals willing to suspend their judgment about others and become curious. Stephen Covey, in his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, said we have to seek to understand before we seek to be understood. We have to really help people empty their cups before we can try to offer something new for them to fill it up. And I think this process is something we can start as individuals. You know who thinks differently from you. You know who acts differently from you. How can you become curious and approach them with an open heart like a friend and say, you're a reasonable person. You must have very good reasons for why you think, believe, feel the way you do. And I would like to understand your perspective. And I think if we start this one-on-one and actually go beyond acquaintanceship, as Sophia was reading from the spiritual letter, and really develop a deep friendship, even find love for one another, that we'll begin to make some progress. I am a member of the Hayes Center here in North Little Rock, which is about half and half white and black in its membership. I love walking around the track, having conversations with people. One of the things I learned when I lived in Africa is the importance to people of color in being recognized, because they so often feel invisible. And so I learned to greet everyone that I made eye contact with. And when I first came to the center at Hayes, I made an effort to get to know as many people's names as I could. And I greeted particularly the African Americans with their names as I learned them. And I always received a warm and welcoming response. But I knew that I was making an inroads when I wasn't the one greeting first. And they were greeting me and calling my name, because we developed a friendship. Now, the other interesting thing was, and then I'll stop for a minute, is white people would walk around the track with me and assume that I had the same beliefs and opinions as they would. And they would express their concerns about the Black people in the center. And I would listen to them, even draw them out a little bit, and then say, well, you know, I respect your experience, and I want to tell you I have a very different experience. Can I share my experience with you? And I would tell them about my childhood and my beliefs and what my parents would teach me. Yes, Kwame Abdul-Bey is sponsoring coming to the table as a part of his Arkansas Peace and Justice movement. And when I would ask them, have you ever been in the home of a person of color? Do you have any friends who are Black? And invariably they would say no. And I say, well, I'll tell you from my experience, you don't know what you're missing. There is a warmth, an acceptance, a love among the members of this community that we generally miss out on unless we make an effort to draw close. And that has an interesting effect on people. They don't argue back. They don't continue their arguments. As a matter of fact, later in the lunchroom, I saw one of them inviting a Black person to come over to the table that was mostly populated by white. So I just share this as an experience of how we can put our beliefs into practice. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much.
Anybody else want to share a thought on unity, an experience of unity? Yes, Sally?
Well, my experience is the same at the Jim Daly Fitness Center. There are Black, white, old, young, fit, feeble. Everyone is there and equal. Nobody else can work out for you. You got to work out for yourself. So I think that's a great place to experience and advocate unity.
Yes, Kitty.
I love the way you put that, Sally. No one else can work out for you. That's perfect. It's like, yeah, we can't expect.
There's an old song. You got to walk that lonesome valley. You got to walk it by yourself.
Right.
Anybody else? I bet some others among us have experiences like this too. Please feel free to share if you'd like.
Yeah, I'm going to read a short tale from the book, which I read last night. And I want to build on to Dan's comments about unity in the community, and especially building one-to-one relationships. I read the story last night, and it's so beautiful that I think I must share it with everybody. And again, it's the same book, Spiritual Literacy, that we are following. It's a story of an old rabbi. So the rabbi asks his pupils how they could tell when the night had ended and the day had begun. So one of the students said, could it be when you see an animal in the distance and tell whether it's a sheep or a dog? No, said the rabbi. Another one asked, could it be when you look at a tree in the distance and tell whether it's a fig tree or a peach tree? No, answered the rabbi. Then what is it? Students demanded. And the rabbi said, it is when you look on the face, it is when you can look on the face of any man or woman and see that it is your brother or sister. Because if you cannot see this, it is still night for you. So I read that last night, and when Dan, you were speaking, that's all was going in my mind. I wanted to share that.
Thank you, Sophia. Anybody else? Nita, unmute.
Yes, there we go. Dan, I too have lived in Africa twice, and once was in South Africa and once was in Ghana and West Africa. But in my South African experience as an exchange student, I lived with 3 families. For 6 months, a Jewish family. For the next period, an Anglican priest and his family. And for the last period, a Welsh man and his wife who were a Presbyterian minister team. And I found so much unity because of trying to do what you said, listening and seeking to understand what the different belief systems were about in a very volatile time when Nelson Mandela was still on Robben Island and apartheid was fully entrenched. There were all kinds of diametrical things going on and all different sorts of opinions, some very progressive and revolutionary in thought and some very conservative and fascist in my view. And so I learned so much by listening. Now, fast forward all these years later, I have reconnected with my Jewish father, who is now 80 years old. He has become one of the most important people to me because he's still teaching me. And it has become this amazing dialogue. And that's what I see about unity, is if we can somehow break down the need to do away with tensions, as Jay brought up, and instead really be in the moment with people and listen to their stories, we can become students of love. So I just contribute to that.
Dan, Nita is a former campus minister at TCU, Texas Christian University, and is in Texas right now. We're so glad you're here. I'm gonna press my question just a little more about tensions. At a personal level, I think I was really helped by the feminist movement. I have been helped by the feminist movement. And I remember a conversation, a very specific conversation with a woman who was a feminist, no longer with us, who saw in me a lot of male presuppositions. For example, it's easy if you have a fairly strong ego to think the problem is having too much ego. If we could only get rid of our egos, all would be well. And this woman had been actually abused by her husband. And as I talked about transcending the ego and becoming selfless and all that, she said to me, That may be your problem. That may be your experience, but that's not my experience. I've not had an ego at all. I've needed to be a self.
Mm-hmm.
I've needed to. And the only way I could do that is to say no
Mm-hmm.
to my husband. And I realized then that I was speaking out of my own experience and generalizing it, thinking it was everybody's experience. Well, it sure wasn't hers.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that we left that conversation. I don't think she was happy with me.
Mm.
In other words, we didn't shake hands or hug or bow after it was over. She just basically said, you go your way.
Mm.
And so she was angry with me because I had been such a talker. I didn't listen.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I am very grateful to her for her anger.
Mm-hmm.
But it was not a resolved tension. It was an existing tension that I learned from. And so I think that probably many of you have had something like this experience. Have you ever been in the presence of somebody that's really angry with you? And maybe for good reasons. And so the dynamic of that situation was not, let's get rid of this tension so I can be peaceful again. It's in the tension itself that the revelation occurs. So I guess I want to speak to the constructive role of tensions sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Tensions are different from differences. Differences are beautiful. Tensions are slightly less pleasant. Any thoughts on your part? Have you ever experienced those kinds of tensions? And I see Ellen raising her hand. Anybody want to speak to that question of the role of creative tensions in relationships? Ellen, go ahead.
So I just wanted to speak about what's going on now I don't want to speak for all Jews. I can't actually speak for all Jews, but I'll speak for myself as someone who's part of the Jewish community. So Israel, in the definition of the word, means to struggle, right? To struggle with God. And so Jews are always struggling with God, and that's kind of an accepted way to behave in terms of our own struggle and what we believe and how we live from day to day. So it's a struggle in a good way. I don't want to say that it's a struggle in a bad way, but there's a tension there, I think, for most of us. But what's happening right now in the especially in the Reform Jewish movement, is to recognize there is tension there, because there are Jews of color who haven't necessarily felt that they have been fully recognized as part of the community. And there's an effort now to recognize that tension where, we take offense. I'm saying offense kind of, loosely, but when someone says, well, you don't look Jewish. But when we ourselves in the community are saying, well, really, this Black person is Jewish? How is that possible? So there's a recognition now that for several generations, there are people, and many generations, there are people of color who are part of the Jewish community. And we're just now trying to make that right and trying to give people their voice, everyone who deserves, in order to be unified as a Jewish people. So I just wanted to bring that up just as kind of an aside to say that, I personally have had that where I would approach someone and welcome them and, assume that they've been Jewish for 5 years or 10 years or one generation or whatever. And that's not necessarily the case. And so I'm putting myself as an example, but just to say that I think it's a constant struggle to be inclusive and to strive for that feeling of unity.
Anybody else? Or Dan, do you want to respond to anything that's been said so far? Or wait, Sheila first, please. Yeah, Sheila.
I just realized that I've held a tension in myself for several years now, in regards to my own religion. Having been raised in the Christian church and been in the Episcopal communion for most of my adult life, I guess it's been more than a few years now, but I began to study Buddhism, and have really at this point embraced the Buddhist path more completely than I think, well, in the same way that I used to embrace the Christian path. And while my practices have become more Buddhist, even my prayer has become meditation. And I still realize that there is still very much a tension in me, which is, I think, why I have been drawn into an interfaith sort of experience now, because it helps to resolve my own tension.
Mm-hmm.
It helps me to unify with that unity of all religions that Dan spoke about. That helps me to resolve some of that tension, I think, and not to continually struggle with the difference in the theologies of these two paths, so much as being able to unify my experience in me and see that as a unity with God in a way that is just sort of coming to fruition for me. So thank you. And thank you for your presence, Dan, and your own path. That it helps me to hear others speak of their path in a way that resonates with me. So thank you.
Meg, and then Dan, please respond to everything. Meg, go ahead.
Well, I was going to follow up just a little bit on what Ellen had to say. And also, I just put this in the chat, but just to thank Dan so much for everything that he said and how he said it. But, you know, when it comes to unity, one of the things that Dan focused on was communication and being able to listen to people and hear them. But one of the struggles that we have, say, at the temple when somebody new walks in the door, and Ellen spoke to this, is that you don't want to isolate them in any way, shape, or form. So it's this strange tension between, you have to simply communicate your heart. You have to embrace, and that's it. Because if you say, well, what brings you here? Even that is a trigger, which seems like it wouldn't be, and yet it is. So it's as if you have to do it almost telepathically. And I've listened to an African-American rabbi talk about this very thing, that it gets exhausting for him. Every place he goes, somebody kind of questions his legitimacy, what he's doing there. So I'm very much on a path to stop that in its tracks as much as I can.
Dan, I think in the interest of time, Dan, if you would respond, and then Sophia will bring us to closure in some way. Go ahead, Dan.
I think God created tension when he created human beings to be a combination of body and soul. And I think of us not as bodies having a soul, but as souls having a body for a temporary period of time. And the conflict comes because the body is basically an animal that seeks its survival. And it has an ego that seeks dominance. And this is what has colored our relationships because there's this tension between being the physical aspect being dominating and the spiritual aspect being not really submissive, but more softer, unifying, etc. And I'm kind of getting lost in my own thought now, but I think this dynamic tension exists throughout our lives because the needs and the desires and the drives of the body often put us in conflict with others, and we need to exercise our spiritual powers in order to overcome our natural inclinations. But all of this is natural and is a part of the system of testing us that God has given us to grow spiritually. So I'll stop there.
Dan, thanks. And Sophia, you have experienced a different kind of harmony, it seems to me, in your interfaith work. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on the role that the interfaith endeavor is doing or can do to help shape souls and bring about a kind of unity. And I say that in the context of, it seems to me, Dan, that Baha'i is one of the first truly global initiatives in interfaith cooperation, because it's tried to include so many differences, racial, ethnic, you name it. Sophia, please.
Firstly, yes, I want to thank you, Dan and Jay, for today's class, and especially sharing your heart and your soul. Thank you so much for being our guest today. I would like to close while answering this question, if I can answer this question. But what I want to first say is this, that thank you so much to Dan to bring up the concept of unity with God, and for Ellen to mention struggles within, and then for Sheila to mention tensions that we face within our own selves. And it's important for me because coming back to Jay's question, I work with communities who are very different from each other, who believe differently, who look differently, who practice differently. And I try to get to that level of harmony with them, which I call unity. Like I said in the beginning, for me, unity does not mean conformity. Unity means being able to see everybody's differences and being able to live with them in harmony. So it's definitely not easy because you're constantly facing differences. And you have to get to that level of harmony when you can embrace that difference without diluting your own faith and without expecting the next person to change. So what has worked for me personally is I have to go back to my own self. For me, in order to take this outward journey of unity or outward journey of achieving unity within communities, I have to take my own inner journey, my own soul journey. And what I have discovered is that I live with so many tensions within my own self and tensions with God. And at times that I am trying to control and play the role of the God. And at times when I'm submitting. But what I have experienced is that as I take that inner spiritual journey and as I get closer and closer to God with my own relationship, and as I feel that I'm getting touched by the fire of God's love, I find more and more spiritual unity within my own self. And I also realize that it's easier for me to be in harmony with all these people who are different from me, who believe differently. But it does require for me to surrender myself to God first. I cannot do it without that because there has to be a common human denominator which helps us achieve that level of harmony. And for me, that common human denominator has been love for everybody. So anyways, I think it's time to close. We are going to go above, and I would like to read one of my favorite poems again by Hafiz before we close. And the name of the poem is, Would You Think It Odd? And Hafiz, the great Persian poet from 14th century, says, "Would you think it odd if I said, I'm in love with every church? Would you think it odd if I said, I'm in love with every mosque and temple and any kind of shrine? Because I know it is there that people say the different names of the one God. Would you tell your friends I was a bit strange if I admitted I'm indeed in love with every mind and heart and body and soul? Oh, I'm sincerely plumb crazy about your every thought and desire and yearning and limb and step. Because, my dear, I know that it is because through these that you search for Him, for one true God." Thank you all very much. We will meet you next time, which is our last session for this, which is our last class for this fall session, and then we'll break for 2 weeks. Have a blessed day.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
Enjoy the snow, Sophia.
You can see it in the back.